One of my favorite places on earth is Cedar Point, roller coaster capital of the world. When I was a little kid, it's been a few years, I haven't been in a while, but when I was a little kid, there was nothing better than spending the whole day at the roller coaster capital of the year. We went almost every single year. Labor Day weekend, we would drive down after church on Sunday, we'd stay in a hotel, and then that morning, the next morning on Labor Day, we would go to the park, and we'd be there as soon as they opened up, and we would spend all day, dawn until dusk, riding roller coasters. We didn't leave till they kicked us out, right? And then Dad had to drive us home. Over the years, different parks have tried to compete. They try to make something faster. They try to make something taller. But every time they do, Cedar Point gets to work building something even faster and even taller, right? Even better. And now, from the corn dogs to the cotton candy, from the Blue Streak to the Raptor, from the Mantis to the Millennium Force, and of course, the Top Thrill Dragster, where you wait for 3 hours for a 15-second ride simply because it is the tallest and the fastest. Actually, it's second tallest now, so Cedar Point's got to get to work. But for children, the worst part of any roller coaster park, Cedar Point included, is the height restriction. You know what I'm talking about, right? You got to be this tall to ride the ride, and they got those little like cardboard cutouts of a cartoon kid holding a ruler and a little stop sign. Not tall enough, and you know you're not tall enough, so you're like walking around on your tiptoes hoping to like pass the line, be inconspicuous, because you know that worked. Not tall enough to ride the ride. I don't know that I've talked about this much as the pastor at this church, but I was always kind of a small kid, right? I'm not that tall of a guy. I was a short person. I was young for my grade, and so I was always very short. I've never been a big guy, and I never cared. That stuff doesn't really matter, except when you're going to Cedar Point. It matters a lot at Cedar Point. And so every year, right, the night before Cedar Point, we would measure, all right, how tall am I? Which rides can I go on? And then I would look, like at the map, because they all had the height restrictions listed on the map. All right, I'm plotting out my way. Which one am I going to go? Now, I grew up with 2 brothers and a sister. And one of my brothers, he's only 2 years younger than me. And so we were pretty close in height growing up. And so every year we would go to Cedar Point, and my mom would take my other brother and my sister off to like the kiddie ride area. And my brother and I and my dad, we would go hit the roller coasters all day long. And I don't know, one year I must have eaten my Wheaties because I was finally tall enough to ride the Raptor. I don't know if you've ever been to Cedar Point, but the Raptor is a big deal. It's right by the entrance of the park. So every year you had to walk past the Raptor, and you get to watch them like flying by over your head, and you're just, I want to be on that ride. So one year I was finally tall enough, and I was so excited. And I get there, and I stand up straight, and I walked right past the Blue Streak, my previous favorite, and I headed straight for the Raptor. And I stood up tall, and I walked, and I hit my head on the thing. I was tall enough to ride the Raptor. And I looked at my brother, and I said, come on, Ben, I'm finally tall enough. Let's go. And he got all excited, and he ran right under the line. Shoot. And of course, and then there's the little attendant guy there, right? Oh, little buddy, can't ride the ride. And being the loving, caring, compassionate big brother that I am, I turned to my little brother and realized he cannot join me on this roller coaster. And I said, do you want to hold my backpack? This is not a good big brother. Now, as a child, we don't understand height restrictions. Right? We don't know about physics and all this stuff. We don't know that the weight to height ratio of the machine makes it dangerous. You might slip out of the harness, or if you're not developed enough, the physics of a roller coaster can be deadly. As children, you just kind of think they're being mean. Right? At the roller coaster park, they're just so mean. They must not like children. I remember, we can't see that we need to grow. We need to hit a certain height in order to experience the ride, to enjoy the ride. I used to argue with my dad about the height restriction. Like, I used to argue with him and be like, don't they know that it's not my fault that I'm this way? It's not my fault that this is who I am. How dare they? Like, I was going to win that argument with my dad, right? Like, he doesn't have control. But the truth is, Cedar Point is not blaming me for my height. They are simply telling me you need to grow before you can experience this ride. Now, there's some parallels to our spiritual development, and we'll get to that in a second, but suffice it for now to say that even if it is not your fault, there are things that we cannot experience until we have grown. Today is week 2, in our sermon series called Old Testament Stories of Trust. Tremel got us started last week, and we talked about the story of Noah. And we saw that it is God's ability that matters, not our own ability, right? We talked about how Noah was not a carpenter. He was not a boat builder, and yet God chose him because it's not about our abilities. It's all about leaning on God. So today we're talking about the story of Rahab the prostitute. We're going to look at what it means when we make mistakes. And so to kind of set the stage for our story a little bit, you got to remember Moses. You guys remember the story of Moses? And he took the slaves and he freed them from Egypt, and he parted the Red Sea, and they crossed over and they go to the desert, and then they wandered in the desert for 40 years. And then Moses passes away. Moses dies, and they raise up a new leader named Joshua. Joshua was appointed as a new leader. And so now the people of Israel are finally ready to enter into the promised land. When God pulled them out of Egypt as slaves, he pulled them out of Egypt and he promised, I've got this amazing new home for you. I'm going to give you the promised land. And so they get to the edge of the promised land and they are so excited, but there's already people living in the promised land. And they do not like God, and they do not like the Israelites. And so Joshua actually is a little bit like a military commander. The people of Israel had to fight their way into their homeland. And so Joshua's getting ready, and the first stop right on the edge of their homeland is the city of Jericho. And so Joshua's getting ready to fight the battle of Jericho, right? But then he decides, you know what? I'm going to send in some spies. I'm going to send in a couple of spies first to scope out the city. Now, I don't know who these guys are. Right? It doesn't say their names. It just says that he sent 2 men into the city. But they are the worst spies ever. Well, we're going to see chapter 2. Just watch this. This is amazing. And Joshua, son of Nun, sent 2 men secretly from Shittim as spies and said, go view the land, especially Jericho. And they went, and they came into the house of a prostitute whose name was Rahab, and they lodged there. What? Their job is to scope out the land of Jericho, so they go directly to the prostitute's house, which is a little suspicious, but I'm sure they were just there for the articles. Verse 2, and it was told to the king of Jericho, behold, men of Israel have come here tonight to search out the land. Then the king of Jericho sent to Rahab, saying, bring out the men who have come to you, who entered your house, for they have come to search out all the land. These are the worst spies ever. Not only do they begin by first going to the prostitute's house, but then the king is not only aware of exactly where they are, but also why they are there. I don't know what the ancient version of the CIA is, but they're terrible at training their operatives. These men are the worst spies I've ever seen. And so Rahab, the story continues in verse 4, and Rahab takes the guys and she hides them up on the roof. And she leads the guards in the other direction. And then she goes up on the roof and she talks to them, and basically she says, look, here's the deal. I believe that your God is the God, and I think that God is with you. And I know what's coming, and I don't want to be on the other side of that conversation. And so in verse 10 she says, for we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea before you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the 2 kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, to Sihon and Og, whom you devoted to destruction. And as soon as we heard it, our hearts melted, and there was no spirit left in any man because of you. For the Lord is your God. He is God of the heavens below and heavens above and the earth below. And then she turns to the men and she says, when you take the city, not if, when you take the city, will you spare my family, me and my family? Will you spare our lives? And the men agree. So then she lets them out of the city. She actually lowers them out the window on a rope, and they escape out of Jericho, and they get back to Joshua. Now, there's a lot more to the story of Jericho, and if you get the chance, check that story out. Literally, these guys, they march around the city over and over blowing trumpets, and the walls crumble for no reason. It's an amazing, kind of bizarre story, but we don't really have time to get to all of that, because today I want to focus in on the character of Rahab. Rahab is sort of a tragic character. It says that she's a prostitute, which makes us all kind of clutch our pearls and say, oh my gosh, no. A prostitute? No. You like that, huh? But what I want to show you today is that there are several different types of prostitutes. There's the wealthy prostitutes who chose that lifestyle, and then there's the rest of them, the great majority of them. Prostitution is and was a form of slavery. It often worked hand in hand with what we call debt slavery. Back in this time, if you couldn't pay your debts, you could be forced into prostitution. And that actually is how it works in the modern world as well. There's almost always an economic, financial component to modern prostitution. Now, Rahab's whole family lives with her in her house, and there's a really good chance that she was supporting her entire family with her slavery, which does not sound like the actions of a wealthy woman. There's a good chance she was forced into this. Now, unfortunately, this is a very real issue even in the modern world. A lot of people don't realize that. But human trafficking and sex slavery is still a very real thing. Globally, the United Nations estimates that human trafficking is a $32 billion industry every single year. Now, because it's illegal and it's underground, it's hard to nail down exactly how many people are in slavery, but they estimate there are roughly 40 million people in our world who are still slaves. But here's the scary part. 400,000 of them live in the United States. They estimate that 17,000 people will become slaves in America this year alone. That's 46 people a day here in the land of the free. A few years ago, the people who combat sex trafficking and are working against that, they identified one of the biggest sex trafficking events in an entire year is the Super Bowl. Every year at the Super Bowl, it's a big event. People are drinking, they're partying in a strange city. It is very easy to disappear somebody. NPR did an article about it in 2018, just like a year and a half ago. The scariest statistic of the reported cases of human trafficking, these are the confirmed reported cases of human trafficking in the 50 United States, Michigan ranks number 2 in most common for human trafficking. Think about this stuff as something that's far away. It doesn't happen everywhere, far in other places, but it's here. We are the second most common place for someone to get abducted into human trafficking. Now, I haven't talked about this all that much in my time at this church, but the sex trafficking industry and the pornography industry they feed off one another. They kind of have this really unhealthy supply and demand relationship in our world. And both of them, I would say, are a root of evil in our culture. Now, I want to clarify. There's a big difference between the wealthy who choose that line of work and the great majority who are forced into that world. The men and women are usually trapped. They cannot just walk away. Now, I don't share all of this to freak you out or to scare you or anything like that. I want you to see two things. Number one, Rahab was probably forced into this difficult, impossible situation. And number two, this is not an issue of history. This is real life here and now in Flushing, Michigan, 2020. Slavery and sex slavery, it's not gone. We just hide it better. Now here's where it gets really difficult for Christians. We start talking about this tragic situation, right? And we start talking about sin and brokenness. All humans sin. That's absolutely true. Unknowingly even. And you hear stories like this and you start to wonder, well, okay, what if sin is not our fault? I mean, the whole sin conversation seems really unfair. It's not Rahab's fault, this situation that she's in. And then we start to throw around words like necessary evil or the lesser of two evil. We rationalize. We do this thing where we try to make it okay. Here's what the story goes like, right? This is what we hear. It says God creates human beings, but he makes it possible for them to fail. Then he puts those humans in a broken world where they are likely to fail. Then human beings fail, and God gets mad at them for failing. And it looks like it's just not fair that God would be mad at us like that. God is being unfair. That's what the story of Christianity looks like to a lot of people outside the church. People say, well, you can't blame us for being the way that you created us. You can't blame Rahab and say you're a bad person for being a prostitute. If you put her in a situation where she has to, we take the blame of this broken world and we try to put it up on God. And because you made us this way, we look at the world and we see, we started off good, and then we fell and we got broken, and then God put us back together, but that whole equation doesn't seem fair. If we were designed for a broken world, can you really blame us when we are broken by the world? Now here's the biggest thing I want you to catch this morning. Human beings are not designed for this world. Let me say it again. Human beings are not designed for this world. You were designed for something better than this broken world. When we fall and we break and we fail, God saves us. He redeems us. He lifts us up. Redemption is not a return back to the normal. We're not going back to perfection. We never had perfection. We start out in this world, and this world will fail us. And when we are broken and stepped on and we are crushed, God calls us to move beyond this world. Set your sights a little higher. Don't go back to the world, to the way things were before. That's how you ended up broken. God's not putting you back there. God heals us, restores us to something better than we ever were. This life with God is better than this life without God. Redemption doesn't move backwards. Redemption only moves forward. We talk about this thing where we call on the Holy Spirit to come into our life and set up shop in our heart and transform us. Not to put us back together to what we used to be, but to make us a new person, to give us a new heart. We say, God, I want you to wash me clean so that I can start over in a new way. God did not design you for this world, so don't settle for this world. Redemption does not move backwards, it only moves forward, so move forward. This culture that we live in loves to rationalize. They love to try and make it seem like the answers that they are providing are good enough, right? They want you to believe that this world is all there is and that that's good enough. It's good enough for now. But let me ask, if you tell a lie for a good reason, does that make you less of a liar? If you kill someone for a good reason, does that make you less of a killer? No, but the world thinks, yeah, sure, we've got these whole arguments about white lies and self-defense to make it okay for us to do things like kill and lie and steal. We make these arguments, these logical statements that make us feel better. But what I want you to see this morning is that is the mentality of a broken world. The good enough thought process is something that comes from the broken world. Sin is sin. Always is, always had been. God's idea for you is perfection. He's talking about a new world. I hope it's obvious that I'm talking about heaven, right? You were designed for heaven. You were not designed for this world. You were designed for the next world. The lesser of two evils is still evil, right? Necessary evil is still evil. Don't settle for that. Don't settle for the solutions the world offers you. It's not good enough. God calls us to holiness. He calls us to something better than anything the world has to offer. Can you imagine a world where there is no necessary evil? There is no lesser of two evil. There is no evil. That's what God has designed you for. God has designed you for an existence inside perfection. He has built you for heaven. Don't settle for this world when God has called you beyond this world. We look at this life, at this whole sin conversation, and what I want you to realize is it's not God up in heaven saying, you're so terrible. God's not up there looking at human beings and blaming us for acting like humans. Instead, God, what he's saying is, you're incomplete. You're not done growing yet, and I need you to grow if you're going to experience what's coming. I need you to grow up in my grace so that you can experience the perfection of heaven that I have put for you. You are incomplete. He sees that we are not ready for the next step. On the roller coaster ride, I'm not blaming you for being too short, for being broken and full of mistakes. I'm saying you need to grow before you can experience what comes next. So we need to outgrow this world. We are not designed for this world. Set your sights a little higher, eyes up. Flushing. There is within each of you the potential for perfection. You were called to live a holy life, to live a perfect life. And so in each of us, there is a desire for something more. We are aware of good and evil, right? We're aware of good and evil, and we know what's good and what's evil to some extent, right? We have vague gray areas, but for the most part, we are drawn to what's good. And we want to avoid what's evil. When I read all those statistics, some of you were just mortified. Like that shook you, and you were like, oh my gosh, you're having this gut reaction to this evil that I've told you about. And that urge, that gut reaction, that tells you that you were designed for something more. You were not designed to live in a world where that stuff happens. You were designed to live in a world that is perfect, created for you, eternal in the heavens. Now, let me ask this. Why would God create us as incomplete? Why does he create human beings that are not fully grown? Why doesn't he create us perfected? Like, why doesn't he make us already perfect? Why do we have to go through this journey where we make mistakes and then we lean on God's redemption? Why do we need that? Well, let me answer that question with a question. Why do we make babies that are babies? Wouldn't it be easier, like more convenient, if children were born all grown up? Like, wouldn't it be way easier if we were popping out 35-year-olds who just finished school and have a solid job? That'd be so much more convenient. Raising children is hard. Of course, that's ridiculous, because there is joy in the journey, as every parent can tell you. It's hard. It's much harder this way, but there is joy in the journey. Parents, we guide our children through the mistakes because we want them to grow. We leads to a better life. God is the same way in our lives. God wants you to grow. He wants you to grow. He wants you to reach the next level. He wants you to aim yourself at heaven. There is joy in the journey. It is harder this way. The path of walking, and having mistakes, and being redeemed by God, that is harder than if we were just perfect. But redemption lifts you to a level that is beyond this world. Last week we asked the question, what if I'm not the best? And we realized you can let go of that because you're not the best. God is the best. Today we ask the question, well, what if I make mistakes? What if I screw up? What if I am associated with the lowest in the world? And Rahab teaches us that, yeah, you're going to make mistakes. You're going to fall, and you're going to fall far. But God doesn't make mistakes. You are not a mistake. We are not defined by the curse. You are not defined by the mistakes you have made in your life. You are not defined by the things that push you down into the darkness. You are defined by redemption. You are defined by God's love. Two pieces to this, and then we're done. Number one, define yourself by redemption. Define yourself by God's forgiveness. Define yourself in God's love. Stand in God's life. There is an access to perfection in your connection to God. You can grow more like Jesus if you work towards standing in the light. It's hard work. It's not easy. It's not obvious, but it will help you get ready for the ride that is coming. Don't waste your time settling for this world, rationalizing why this sin is okay or that necessary evil is necessary. Don't settle for this world. Rise above this world. Realize that you were not created for the mediocrity of a broken world. You were created for something better than this world. Don't settle. Stand with God. And then the next step is if you're going to stand, if you're going to define yourself by redemption, and you're not going to let the mistakes of your life define you, next step is to grow with God. If God's working in your life, you are growing. Christianity is not a stale effort. Redemption does not move backwards. Every mistake you make in life, it can either set you back or it can propel you forward. The only difference is how you respond to your mistakes. I heard this thing this past week about the symbolism of an arrow. And the arrow is an amazing symbol of progress because the only way it can go forward is if it goes backwards. You have to draw the arrow back before you can launch it into what's coming. So if you feel like you're being drawn backwards, if you're being pulled back in your life and you just can't get ahead, maybe God is about to release you and send you into what's coming next. I saw that this past week. I was like, oh, well done, Facebook. What we do with the mistakes of today, that determines what tomorrow is going to look like for you. So look at the mistakes of your life and ask yourself, what are you going to do with your mistakes? Are you going to let it overwhelm you? Are you going to give it to God? Step into your identity as redeemed and let that propel you into something beyond this world. What if I make a mistake? What if I make a lot of mistakes? Well, let's be clear, you're going to make mistakes. But with the love of God found in his Son, Jesus Christ, we can arise above this world and step into God's plan for your life. Only a God like ours would set up a system where every pain in this world has the potential to set us free, to make us stronger. The world will try to break you. Maybe it has broken you. But you were not designed for this world. And so I'll leave you with this. May you never make a mistake. But when you do, may you use it to grow stronger. May you learn from your mistakes. May God work his redemption in your heart to use the pain of this life to create a better future and a better world. Amen.